Big story tonight, Bharti and MTN have called off their deal, and I'm going to quote from Bharti's press release. This structure, that's the deal structure, needed an approval from the government of South Africa, which has expressed its inability to accept it in the current form. In view of this, both companies have taken the decision to disengage from discussion. But neither Bharti's press release nor the press release from the South African Treasury Department gives us any detail of what the specific stumbling blocks could have been for this deal to be called off. In fact, the Treasury Department release indicates that they were informed by MTN that talks were being called off. So what went wrong? Well, to discuss that, I'm joined by Abhisar Diwanji of KPMG, Vivek Gupta of BMR, Bradley Skop of South African legal firm Eversheds, and we'll also be talking to Adi Godrej in just a bit. He has a business in South Africa. Abhisar, I'm going to come to you. You represented another firm last year that was interested in MTN. You've watched this deal that Bharti has sort of reopened this year in great detail. I have a question to ask you. Did dual listing figure anywhere in either the previous talks or in your assessment in the earlier part of Bharti's talks with MTN when they reopened the deal this year, or has it come as a total surprise in the last month or so?
Well, America, let me tell you, I think the past deal was a different era. But talking about the current deal, and if you look at it, this deal can be actually, the MTN-Bharti deal can effectively be divided into two broad parts. Part one is a situation where the commercials were being discussed. There was a stage when the valuations were questioned, the deal structures were questioned. There were certain large shareholders who wanted a larger part of the Bharti pie or larger cash. Those commercial issues remained unresolved, and we went into the second phase where we effectively spoke about the regulatory issues, that the dual listing issues, the fact that we needed the identity of both countries to be maintained in respective companies, etc. So ideally there were two phases of these deals, the two large extensions, and each coming up with two sets of unresolved issues, one deal related and one fairly much larger and incapable of being resolved in the time period of the deal.
But Abhisar, my question still holds. When you were actually negotiating this deal on behalf of another telecom firm, did you come across a South African government demand for dual listing in this country? Though I do know that the structure has differed from last year. I know you're saying the world has changed since then. But did you sense this whole protection of nationalistic identity even back then, or has it just come up?
I think well, at that stage, I guess it never moved to that particular level. But in the Bharti stage, for example, it actually reached that level only in the second part. So it does say that, well, there were commercials, and there were commercials which remained unresolved, and there were the nationalistic issues which came up later. So I guess, maybe in the earlier deal, and I wasn't involved in that part of the deal anyway, but in those parts of the deal, I guess it did not reach that stage, but here it did.
All right, let me get Bradley Skop in. Bradley, neither the Bharti press release nor the press release from the Treasury Department lays out in detail what could have been the potential stumbling blocks for both parties to call off the talks. But in your assessment, knowing the South African legal space very well, what do you think could have been the big stumbling blocks for this deal for which the two parties have now decided to disengage?
MTN is a South African national asset. I mean, there's no getting away from that. And certainly, MTN has really been built on a very valuable and lucrative license over the last 15 or so years. So certainly, any taking offshore of that would have had to involve some recognition, if you like, of South African assets and the interests of South Africans as well. In particular, that, a number of South Africans have been empowered. Certainly previously disadvantaged South Africans have been empowered through shareholdings in MTN, through pension funds, through trusts, and individuals as well. And certainly I would imagine that the government would have wanted to protect that as well. I think what is worth mentioning is that, there have been a number of large other South African companies in other sectors, in particular in the mining, minerals, and financial sectors, that have done this kind of deal. They have done so through some sort of dual listing when they have gone offshore. So there's certainly a precedent for it in South Africa.
All right. So you're saying dual listing didn't just come up in this one deal. Do you think that this deal could have been scuppered because of a protectionist stance by the South African government, Bradley?
No, on the contrary, I don't think South African government is protectionist. I think what the South African government has done is, while it's recognized certainly that the multinational ownership of former South African assets or assets that historically might have been purely South Africa is very doable. But equally, from the South African perspective, it's a balancing of a number of interests. What should also be pointed out is, South Africa has had a historic legacy, certainly under the previous apartheid regime, where South Africa was very isolated, but equally there wasn't a proper distribution of wealth. And one of the mandates of the South African government, certainly the mandate that's been given to government, is to protect the interests of all South Africans. And where MTN is a vehicle to assist in empowering South Africans, that's also got to be taken on board in any structure that takes place.
All right, I get the point you're making, Bradley, but the fact is that MTN has now been in play almost half a dozen times, maybe even more. To have, negotiation after negotiation and have them fall apart can clearly not reflect very well. Do you think that this company, it will be easy for any foreign telecom major to be able to buy this company, or do you think that the South African government will try and cling on to the last remaining jewel in its crown, so to speak? Because we've seen how the big telecom deals happen in South Africa, and I know that some of them did face opposition towards the end of their deals. Vodafone, for example, when it was trying to buy out the remaining stake in Vodacom. But do you think MTN will be able to find a suitor?
Yeah, I don't see why it shouldn't. I mean, certainly MTN is already, has a multinational footprint. MTN is certainly not only a South African company. While certainly South Africa is one of the jewels in the MTN crown, other examples are Iran, Nigeria, etc. MTN is already a multinational company. So certainly there's already been a willingness from government to allow MTN, if you like, to spread its wings. The real question is finding the right suitor, but equally, any decision, and I'm sorry for repeating myself, but any decision that's made has to take into account, if you like, the balancing of South African interests with the fact that certainly, and look, there are precedents. Telkom, our fixed line operator, had an international partner for a number of years, and certainly there was a lucrative deal there. Vodacom, our largest mobile operator, bigger than MTN in South Africa, has always had an international presence. Cell C, the other mobile operator, has an offshore partner. So certainly there's a very strong precedent for working with offshore partners. It's just to strike the right deal.
All right, Abhishek, do you agree with that having been through 6 or 7 different kinds of negotiations, 2 of them with Bharti itself, it's going to be easy for MTN to find a suitor? I know that in some sense they were in the negotiating position, right? Because Bharti wanted them more than they probably wanted Bharti. Am I right in assuming that?
That would be our perception, yes.
Yeah, Abhishek?
Yeah, I would agree actually. But what really does happen is that if you have deals which actually get deferred or cancelled a multiple number of times, there obviously is a level of, as you say, some kind of a issue doing a deal with somebody else. So somebody else who would fall into the MTN arena will certainly think twice or thrice before he's in a position to successfully enter in. I mean, if you look at it here, what it seems is that there have been issue after issue which has been raised as the deal goes along, and there has not been too many resolutions coming out of it. So at the end of it, I think a new buyer will certainly think not once but twice before starting negotiations.
All right, but Abhishek, what do you think could have been the breaking point? I know you're saying issue after issue. There could have been issues unresolved with shareholders, but that doesn't seem to be the case, because the bankers I was talking to said that the structure of the deal as it stands now is very close to the original structure that they had put out on May 25th when they first put out that first press release, except for maybe some valuations changing. So what do you think could have been the breaking points?
At the end of the day, there could have been a lot of breaking points. One is on the commercial side, frankly, the outlook would have changed over a period of time since the initial legacy valuations that were agreed. But I think more apart from that, we're both emerging markets, and this is a classic case of a cross-border emerging market to emerging market transaction. And what we see is that emotional issues, etc., play a much larger role. And for example, when Tata's went ahead and acquired a Jaguar, which was also a pretty synonymous brand in the UK, there was no question. The nationalistic UK government never came out and said, oh, it's a nationalistic thing to do. But in India and emerging markets like South Africa, I guess, the emotion plays a very big part. And secondly, we tend to undermine these emotions when we start negotiating. So in a way, a lot of these issues, if you follow the Bharti deal as it's rolled on, a lot of these issues seem to have come as an afterthought, one after the other, and taken huge proportions. So in a way, I think it's in a way doing deals in more mature markets and between emerging markets itself, I think is a question worth thinking about.
Bradley, how would you respond to that very same question? Do you agree with our guest here in India, Abhizar? What do you think could have been a few of the key breaking points that led to this deal falling apart?
I think there are a couple that certainly, and some of these are rumors and some of them are more solid. I think certainly there is an element around valuation, and there may be an element of emotion as well. Certainly, MTN is a major national asset, as you correctly pointed out earlier. But, I think there might be a couple of other points as well. MTN does have a few, there are some individuals and some rather large shareholders as well that have specific stakes. And one is mindful that those individuals would have dealt with it at an arm's length commercial basis. So at the end of the day, while there might be a national imperative and there might be emotion and everything else, equally there's got to be a commercial deal that's satisfactory to all parties. And it seems to me that through the various negotiations, things have taken place. Ultimately, the strong commercial imperative also hasn't been met. And I don't think we should lose sight of that.
So you're saying that you actually believe that at the very heart of it, maybe the two parties, Bharti and MTN, themselves could not come upon one mutually agreeable commercial transaction. Is that what you're alluding to?
It's possible. I mean, it's just as much of an explanation as the dual listing or regulatory or emotional or any other potential factor. I mean, at the end of the day, the key, the cornerstone to any possible contract between the two would have been a proper commercially viable, alternative that was acceptable to all shareholders.
You don't think that the stumbling blocks had anything to do with regulatory issues in South Africa? Because I was talking to some of the bankers close to the deal, and they said that the filing that had been done with the Treasury in South Africa was to get permissions from the South African Treasury on a variety of issues, such as the share swap, because it would involve, MTN doing a share swap with a foreign company, that is Bharti, and a whole host of other such issues. So do you think exchange controls or maybe even objections from the telecom regulator, could those have been issues?
Look, there's certainly an element to that. That certainly would have had to play, and certainly all of those would have been brought to bear. But again, those also in turn would have been informed by the commercial deal that was struck.